Sean's a futurist and an author. He'll talk to you a little bit about his book Transition Point, but I think his vision will really help to pull together some of those insights from this morning and set us on our journey towards synthesis. So thank you very much, Sean.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. That's a definite post-lunch good afternoon, that one really, isn't it? Yeah. I'm hoping you had protein rather than carbs for lunch. Anyway, a little bit different to the other sessions you may have. This is going to be a little bit more fast-paced. Don't worry, I'm not going to get you doing star jumps or anything like that. I normally spend about 60 to 90 minutes talking about this, and I initially had 10. I managed to bite my way up to about 15, so I'm going to be cramming a lot of material into a short period of time, so I hope you can stick with me on this. I'm sure most of you have heard this term, VUCA. Who's heard it? Put your hands in the air, wave them just like you don't care. Yeah, most people. I first heard it in 2009. It was used by Gartner at the supply chain event here in London to define the post-economic crash environment. You know, it's volatile, it's uncertain, it's complex and ambiguous, and kind of every consultancy in the world's used it multiple times since. And they keep saying we need VUCA leadership and we need to adapt to a VUCA world. And the one thing they didn't really answer is the one thing that really interested me, which is why? Why is it VUCA? I started work in the 1980s, went through to the 1990s. Didn't feel very VUCA then. You always took to define what next year's plan was. You took last year, added a aspirational percentage to it, and that was your plan. Now you don't know what you're doing next week. So why is it so VUCA right now? And in fact, that little sort of question combined with the fact that at around about this time a decade ago, I'd noticed there was a trend of new technologies that when you stretched them across the end-to-end supply chain was leading to what I called at the time, you know, supply chain 3.0, the fully automated supply chain, and wrote articles about that then. But, well, actually, we've got this new wave of change, which is looking at automating the entire supply chain, and it's very disruptive. And I really want to understand why it's disruptive right now, and more importantly, what does it mean? So I told my wife I was going to take 3 months off to write a book on it, but 6 years later, when I finally finished it, she said, thank God we can get some money back in the house now. One of the key things that came out of that is that change is not linear, it's cyclical. We've always talked about boom and bust, but we forget it in the boom times because times are good, and then we remember it on the bust times. And the reality is it's driven by something called Kondratiev waves, named after a Soviet economist called Nikolai Kondratiev, and his work was picked up by more famous Austrian economist called Joseph Schumpeter, who defined the reason behind it, and that is the forces of creative destruction. So about 65% of the wave is in the upswing, which is where we talk about entrepreneurship and experimentation, which is the time we're in right now. And then a lot of these technologies mature, the market matures, and then money moves around to find easier money somewhere else, usually from financial products like, I don't know, subprime mortgages, for example. And then the whole thing damping collapses. We've been through 5 of these, we're now in the 6th, and interestingly, each one of these creates a new power source, usually creates new transport mechanisms, new communication mechanisms, and whole new types of industry, which generates whole new levels of wealth, but causes the creative side, causes the wealth, and then of course the destruction of the old industries. And what we're finding is that actually these are speeding up. They're becoming more frequent, these waves become more frequent, they're becoming more impactful, they're diffusing faster because initially they traveled the world by sailboat, now they're traveling the world by, you know, the internet speeds. And of course the scope. The first industrial revolution involved this country here, and then Germany got involved with Japan and the US in the second industrial revolution, and now of course it's a completely global revolution, which means the number of brains involved in it has exponentially increased as well as the market size. So the reality is they look a little bit more like that. They're getting faster and higher and more impactful. And we're in the 6th wave now. Now, interestingly, as I went through my research, what we found out is each one of these waves creates whole new levels of disruptive innovations, which leads to a complete paradigm shift in the way how things work and what is possible. Money moves towards the new innovation when it looks like it's going to be a good investment, and that ultimately creates new markets and new businesses, but it leads to the destruction of the old industries that were wedded to the old paradigms. And then we will have a cultural lag, so the innovators move to them very quickly, but obviously the laggards take a lot longer, and if you're not quick enough, then you might end up being part of the destruction, not part of the creation. The sort of Darwinism that Katie talked about earlier, which I'll talk about a bit more. And we're right now in the midpoint of the upswing. So when I started talking about this a decade ago, we were pretty much slap bang in the middle, which is why my book was called kind of Transition Point. But actually, this is the transition point we're in now. This is what we're leading to. And the person whose work I think has been most influential looking at this in recent times is Carlota Perez from the University of London. And if you look at the details in there, she talks about 2 phases of creative destruction and this sort of financial bubble that collapses, and if we're successful and we get through it, will lead to a no golden age. And if you look around at some of the stuff she put here, and she wrote this book well over a decade, you can see we're going through that right now. Crypto markets collapse, economy collapsing right now. We are right in the middle of that point in time. And these transition periods, historically, from the first industrial revolution through every industrial revolution right up to now, are times of great unrest and danger. There's wealth inequality that people with capital make big, people with their labour to sell see that their labour being devalued and maybe even reduced by machines, and it creates social inequalities. And as long as we recalibrate, as long as there are recalibrations, then we move forwards, and as long as there's more winners than there are losers, society moves forwards into the new golden age. So it's very important that we do this recalibration and we ensure that we have enough winners. And those 2 pictures there were both from Paris, the first industrial revolution, and of course the yellow vest protests that took earlier. And also, it's a time where the old world doesn't make sense anymore. We've now gone from black swans, the whole concept of the black swan, from being rare to being bloody everywhere nowadays. You know, wake up in the morning, what new black swan has hit us today? And that managing this from a supply chain perspective has become incredibly difficult because the level of decision making has gone from we need a sort of monthly process where we sit around a table and the strategy people sit up here and the operational people sit down there. It doesn't work anymore. I would argue that it never did. But we got away with it because we were in the downswing. Now in the upswing, of course, the level of decision-making, the mix of strategy, tactics, and operations actually has to be understood across the end-to-end supply chain. The thing most people forget, though, is we've been here before. It is cyclical, and we have seen these issues before. So the headlines here from the previous wave at this time are very, very reflective of what we're seeing now. In fact, we're hearing a lot in the news. Is this going back to the 70s? Are we seeing the economics of the 70s? We have been here before and survived it, and the world got better as a result. Now, the interesting thing is there are 2 phases to creative destruction. Phase 1 before this transition period, and then phase 2 that comes after it. And the first phase is generally when we see the emergence of new technologies and they get applied to make more things that we do already more efficient. And the second phase is more about transforming the way we do things. So if you think of the previous wave, we saw the personal computer in the first wave, which really made sort of your word processing and secretarial jobs more efficient. In the second wave, we've got the internet, which has transformed everything. And now when we come to this current wave, we're seeing a lot of things that are going to change as well. I'll come on to those in a moment. But if you just look at the first wave that we've just been through, the first phase, sorry, that we've just been through of this wave, and we've seen a whole host of paradigm shifts. We've seen come from the company being in control of the process to the consumer being in control. We've moved from single-channel linear models to omni-channel with variable costs. We've seen physical shopping at set times where the retailer determines what time you shop, to us deciding what time we shop and where we want the items to be delivered to. Where you previously got delivered to the store, now it gets delivered to us. So we've moved from linear push supply chains to very cyclical pull value chains. We've moved from the sale of physical products and assets to actually the provision of services and experiences. We've moved away from products competing to business models competing. And interestingly, what we're moving away from now is where all of our business interactions were previously with humans to now where a lot of them are actually by machines, chatbots, digital assistants, websites, these sorts of things. And one of the most important ones, of course, is that we've moved away from a belief in infinite economic growth to the realization that we live on a very finite planet. So, Amara's law says that we tend to overestimate the impact of technology in the short term, but underestimate it in the long term. And this is what happens in every way, because we see technologies being applied to the efficiencies in phase 1. Take 3D printing, for example, something I talked about at lunch. In phase 1, it's been basically using to make something we were already making in maybe a little bit more efficient ways. But the real potential is to completely transform what we make, to make new things in new ways. So we tend to underestimate because we've not seen any real radical opportunities arise from it. We tend to think it's a little bit, meh. But the reality is it could completely transform the way we make things. And we are right here at this point in time. We are at the point where a lot of these technologies have been bubbling under, and once we get through this transition point, we will see them emerge in their full glory. So if we take transport, I talked about transport, communication, and energy, for example, and an industry. Take transport. What we've got so far? We've got transport that is different in terms of its fuel source. We've got EV vehicles, but it's the same cars with the same number of people driven by a human on exactly the same roads. It's not a radical transformation, it's just more efficient. So, what's coming down the pipe, of course, is a radical transformation. Autonomous vehicles will change everything, removing the driver from the front. There'll be an autonomous car, autonomous ship, autonomous plane, hyperloops. We're talking about these, we're not seeing them yet. We will see them. Tube logistics companies like Magway looking at putting all of the freight off the road into under the ground. Cargo Soudan in Switzerland, moving all of their freight across Switzerland underground. What about communication? Well, we're seeing smartphones and we're seeing the internet and Zoom, and that's good. But what's coming down the pipe is 5G, 6G, which is going to enable us to have holographic representations, to physically be in the room with someone at the other side of the world, to have AR and VR completely realized, to be able to see that complete digital twin of your organization. What about power? Well, what we're seeing so far, again, is efficiencies. We've seen solar power collapse in terms of price, and getting more powerful, which is an efficiency of an existing terminology. Windmills, kind of been around since Windy Miller, really, hasn't it? Been around a while now, not exactly new technology, but what's coming down the pipe? Fusion, always 30 years away, they say, but actually the organisation I'm working with right now is working quite heavily on fusion. It's probably not 30 years away now. We're getting closer to a modular nuclear energy, for example, looking at extracting power of the sun in space and beaming it back down to Earth, creating hydrogen from pretty much nothing but sunlight and fresh air. They are radical transformations. What about industry, though? What's happening to industry is something called the triple whammy. I call it the triple whammy anyway, you might not. So whammy number one is the replacement of muscle with machine, so human labour, things on the end of your wristies, all being done by some form of robotics. Whammy number two is the thing that has a lot of people spooked because they thought the colour of their collar would protect them, and they find that they're not. That the white collar work is actually more at risk than blue collar work, and this is the automation and knowledge work. And whammy number three is the convergence of those technologies together, the full automation of the end-to-end supply chain. So what we're seeing across that end-to-end supply chain is that they're going to be completely transformative, but it's really dependent on the organization to be able to step up and take advantage of the opportunities that are in front of you. If we take some of the technologies I've just recently been working with, something like decision intelligence, for example, which I think is going to be one of the big things. If we look at the different evolutions of that, level one is sort of the ability to use analytics to describe what's happening in your supply chain. So it's a bit like being stuck in the traffic and your GPS saying, you're stuck in traffic. Thank you, I kind of knew. So it's describing what's happened, but it didn't really help me very much. What's really helpful, more helpful anyway, is something that will predict what's likely to happen maybe in your organization or in your supply chain. There is a bottleneck that you might not know about, but it doesn't tell me what to do about it. It just tells me that there's one likely there. It starts to get really interesting at level 3, where the system starts to make recommendations. There is a bottleneck up ahead, and like a GPS system, I'm advising you of the different routes you might want to take, depending on whether or not you want to maximize for carbon efficiency or cost or speed or agility. What is it you want to do? These are the recommendations we make. And then the final one is the system running itself. Interestingly, a number of organizations are using this technology already. Unilever, for example, has about 60% of its SKU count completely fully autonomous using tools like this. So the first two are really decision support. So this is humans making decisions using data from machines, being able to identify the root cause of issues. Then we've got decision augmentation, which is humans making decisions using recommendations from machines. And then finally, we have sort of decision automation, machines making the decisions. And what we generally find is actually every time the human gets involved in those systems, it generally makes things worse. So here we've got humans in the loop, humans on the loop, as they call it now, and humans out of the loop. So we end up with something that I named about 7 or 8 years ago, when I started talking about this a bit more, as the PAL supply chain. The future supply chain is going to be incredibly personalized. It's going to be less of mass manufacturing, mass distribution, mass marketing, much more understanding the needs of the individual. It's going to be fully automated end to end, and it's going to be local. And then when I started talking about this, people kind of got the first two and went, I'm not with you on the local bit, Sean. They don't say that anymore, because we're seeing this mass reshoring movement, because as we saw with PPE and things like that, this sort of the nationalization element of being able to control your own energy, control your own, PPE production, those sorts of things has become brought home to people once again. Plus the cost of moving things in bulk halfway around the world. Now, the benefit is, of course, sorry, I'll go back to that slide, it is the shorter the supply chain, the stronger the supply chain. It's actually more sustainable if you're only making what you need when you need it and moving it short distance rather than making lots of product just in case and moving it halfway around the world. The challenge, of course, is human. Most of the leaders who run the organizations today, I know, I was aspirational. Most of the leaders who run organizations today were trained in the downswing, were changed with linear, and they were taught to control their organization. Yeah? And so the measures and the cultures they developed all reflected that. But now we're in the upswing, where change is exponential. So the things that we measure, the behaviors that we want, the cultures that we develop, actually have to change as well. And really, this is important because we really need to start thinking transformatively and disruptively because that's the world we're about to enter. As I said here, we didn't really invent the light bulb by keep tweaking with the candle nor messing around with a horse until we got a motor car. It required significant paradigm shifts in our thought process. Now, I'm going to nick Nassim Nicholas Taleb's concept of anti-fragility here, and this is something I'm starting to talk about a lot because I think this is where we need to go. We talk a lot about resilience, and I'm going to say resilience is not enough. Resilience is a return to the previous state once the disruption is over. The previous state is now out of date. We need to continuously evolve. Let's go back again. I'm going to pick on Katie again with this sort of Darwinism nature and this sort of complicit, keep growing and learning as we move forwards from these risks. Fragile organizations, basically I-shaped people in I-shaped functions in their organization, thinking about how they can maximize the efficiency of their process. The reality is we now say we want to be resilient, which is these T-shaped people that I've been talking about for years, people who understand the end-to-end supply chain and work together to deliver a better outcome. And the reality is we actually need X-shaped people who can work across the organization, not just with marketing and finance and people like that, but also with partners and 3PLs and statisticians to really understand what's going on in their organization and focus more on value delivery. So if I take ESG as an example of this, our fragile organization is very much looking at the ESG situation and saying, right, what do we need to report on? And maybe we can do a bit of recycling within each function. So supply, go out and work with suppliers, try and find a more efficient supplier, manufacture and see what you can do in your particular function, etc. The resilient organization understands that it's actually about the end-to-end supply chain. So it might think about reshoring. It might look more at how do we build a more resilient, more sustainable supply chain. But the reality is the real opportunity is a complete rethink using circularity as the principle that says, how do we do what we do in completely new and better ways? How do we deliver more value to the customer? And it might involve us disrupting our own business by doing that. See, most organizations at the moment play not to lose rather than playing to win. And really what we're talking about here is a mindset shift of being able to start to play to win. And looking at sustainability is not something that's being done to you, but something that you actually want to be at the heart of. I'll use very quickly Alban Toffler's quote, you might have seen it before. The problem, I think, really is the unlearning bit for people who've been in business a long time. It's not the young people having to learn new ways of working, it's the people my age having to unlearn everything we've learned over the last 20, 30 years because we think it gives us worth, it gives us experience, it gives us knowledge, and we don't want to let go of that. But if that knowledge is no longer relevant, getting rid of it is probably what you're going to have to do. So people who've done that, people like Unilever, for example, here have said, we went from thinking we knew it all to realizing that actually we had to learn it all. So it was a real paradigm shift in their thinking. So I'll leave you with a couple of slides very quickly because Jan's eyes are boring into the side of my head. So successful digital transformation is actually not about tools and technologies. It's actually more about transforming the mindset, the culture, and the strategy of the organization. See, the problem with transformation is never a lack of ideas. We're full of ideas. The reality is it's a lack of a change in our behavior within our organizations. Most startups win, not because they're smarter, but mostly because they're not weighed down with the baggage of the past, the old industrial models, the hierarchy, the IT systems that we're still implementing, our SAP system from 2006, those sorts of things. They're not weighed down with that. They can just pick and choose what they need in order to deliver value straight to a customer right now. We talk a lot about technology, but technology is just a what and a how, it's not a why. Defining the why is one of the most critical things you actually have to do in your organization. Stop looking at digital as a project, as a journey, not a destination. And it requires a paradigm shift in what your organization's mindset, an ability to redefine what it stands for, what it operates, and also what it rewards within the organization. Again, picking on Katie one more time, something you mentioned earlier was simplicity, incredibly important. We have the mistake of looking at a complex external environment and believing that we have to make our own internal operations more complicated or more complex. The reality is the opposite is true. It's simplification. Go back to first principles, really, and build up from there. Who is your customer? What do they value? What is their job to be done? How can you use new technologies to deliver that job more sustainably, quicker, easier? Those sorts of things. And the question I'd leave you with is, or actually it's a penultimate slide, so I won't be leaving you, bear with it down. Are you digitizing your present business, or are you actually digital transformation? Because a lot of what people say they're digitally transforming actually is just digitizing their existing business processes. Things are never going to be, again, as slow as they are right now. So sorry about that, guys. The challenge really is to become anti-fragile, to make the cultural shift, to be able not just to survive through this period, but to thrive. Thank you.